exceed the speed limit? You're going to ask me when?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm going to come back to then what about if there were times when you should be doing less than what the speed limit says and they get you on that?
That's conditions requiring reduced speed. Okay. I've had this conversation with a couple of lawyers. When can you justify exceeding the speed limit? Well, what if it were 2 o'clock in the morning and you were on 95, nobody else is on the road, perfectly good weather, and you had someone experience a medical emergency? Is that a reasonable ground?
Sounds legitimate.
I think you might be able to say that. What if you had an 18-wheel truck behind you on a 2-lane road just riding your bumper, and nobody else on the road, and you could create an interval by going a little bit above the speed limit to create space, even though he's acting imprudently, so to speak? That might be a reason to say, yes, I know I was exceeding the speed limit. I tried to create some space between me and the guy behind me because he was right on my bumper. So those are some circumstances where you might be able to argue going in excess of the speed limit is reasonable.
And do you know of cases where that actually worked?
No.
No. Okay. Had to ask. Had to ask that, David.
Right.
Okay. If someone is involved with either an accident or some sort of traffic violation, and an officer says, "Get out of the car. You're under arrest." What's that process like? You just submit, shut up, don't say a word, say call a lawyer. What do you do?
Okay. Let's create some more factual background to it.
Give us an anecdote if you'd like.
Right.
If you want to paint a picture.
We could do that. So you're driving along, you get pulled over.
Maybe it was speeding, and maybe the officer suspects something else is going on.
All right. Reasonable suspicion is the standard for the officer to investigate further. But you're still protected by the Fourth Amendment. They can't do an illegal search of your vehicle or any of that. And if you don't want them in your car, you shouldn't consent to them going into your car. Oftentimes, officers will say they found something in plain view. You had marijuana in your car, and they searched your car without your consent. They said they had your consent, or maybe they did. And if they did have your consent, then they can, because it doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment if you consent to it, and they find something. Oftentimes, they'll say it was in plain view. It was, between the seats or whatever.
In the ashtray
or whatever. In the ashtray. So if there's reasonable suspicion and they find something in plain view, you're not going to be protected by the Fourth Amendment. Here's the interesting thing, I think. People get pulled over, and the police officer comes up to the car and says, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Well, yes, I was speeding. Is that an admission? I mean, they have you on radar probably anyway. Or, yeah, I was swerving all over the road. If it were me, and I got pulled over by a policeman, and they said to me, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" With all due respect, I would say, if you don't know, why should I tell you? But that's just me.
And you can say that.
Well, as long as you're respectful.
Are they likely to say, "Okay, you, get out of the car"?
Yeah, I wouldn't actually say what I just said, because that's not really being respectful.
What happens if they do say get out of the car? Should you, shouldn't you? I mean, what do you do
There's a
with that?
statute that says you have to follow the lawful commands of a police officer. So if they ask you to get out of the car, and you're going to be respectful, I would want to know why you're asking me to get out of the car.
And that's a reasonable thing that someone should do.
I think they should be able to ask that respectfully. The police officer should tell you when he is asking you to get out of the car, "We have suspicion of DUI," or some other reason. Those are legitimate reasons to ask somebody to get out of the car, but you should be told or apprised by the police officer before you are asked to get out of the car.
Does he have to Mirandize you before anything else happens? Or
at some point.
At some point.
And here's the point. If he's got reasonable suspicion of a DUI, for example, they can ask you to get out of the car. They don't have to give you Miranda rights yet at that point, because they're not putting you under arrest.
That's the point, okay.
But they can at some point, as you either take a field sobriety test or something, now have reasonable suspicion, then they have to give you Miranda rights. And there are a checklist of rights they have to give you before they give you the field sobriety test.
Such as?
Such as they have to apprise you of why they think that this is the situation, and tell you what your rights are, and then give you, and when I say rights, It doesn't necessarily follow all the Miranda rights, but there are certain rights you have. For example, they may ask you to take a field breathalyzer test. You have a right to refuse that as well as taking any of the tests. But if you do, that's going to give them
More ammunition.
Right.
And should you say, I want a lawyer, and not say a word to them?
If you're being suspected of a crime, I would always do that. And by the way, when you get to the station and they ask you if you want to take the breathalyzer, they also have to give you the right to make a phone call, and they also have to give you the right to have a doctor take blood and do the test that way.
Which might work in your favor if it's been enough time?
Well, I'm not
Or
an
not.
expert in how the alcohol goes through
How
your
it
system
processes,
and how it
yes.
processes.
Sure.
But you know, sometimes the people just have suspicions of the police officer and their equipment and that type of thing. If you have a doctor who would respond to your call and is willing to meet you at a hospital and take it, and you feel more trustworthy of that information, you're entitled to that.
Good to know. If you're driving without a license, but you have one, you went to the beach, you switched cars, whatever happened, someone stops you and you don't have your license, how much trouble are you in? What do you do?
Well, you're supposed to have your
You're
license
supposed to.
on you. But if it's an active license, it's not a real serious problem. Most policemen can check your license on the computer they have in their car. They can check your registration on the computer they have in your car. Here's an interesting situation. What about the police officer who's sitting at the corner watching cars go by and is running plates? Does he have the right to do that? Does he have the right to use information from that? Let's say he runs a plate and it says the plate's expired. Can he now pull you over and give you a ticket for driving on an expired plate? If he had no other reason to pull you over,
Can he do that?
well, that's a good question. I think people would argue that a couple of different things. You can't pull someone over without reasonable suspicion. The police officer might argue that, you know, driving on the street with a license plate in plain view gives me the ground to check it. I would argue it doesn't. There has to be some suspicion of a criminal activity. So just driving a car doesn't rise to the level of a suspicion of criminal activity.
Let me interject this then. What happens with the now click it or ticket that you see posted somewhere? I suspect that that person wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Is that a reason to stop him in the first place? And then does that give him the opportunity then to go after that license plate, I mean the registration that's expired or whatever license plate that's expired?
I would take it the opposite way. If somebody drives by and they have a plate that clearly doesn't have the sticker on it, so now they suspect an expired registration, they can pull you over for the seatbelt violation as a secondary violation.
Interesting. And click it or ticket is certainly something that they seem to be going after. I think that that's true in Massachusetts, true?
I don't do Massachusetts.
Again, I keep asking about Massachusetts. I think you've made a good point about many cases here. We do need to have a lawyer, and it's worthwhile to give them a call before it gets more compounded. Right. We hope that this has been helpful to you, and we thank David for being with us. Hopefully we'll have Jackie with us at next session. And I hope you'll be more prepared the next time one of these things takes place, whether it's a moving violation or the overtime parking ticket. We do thank you for joining us, and we always invite you to send in your questions by email to legalmatters@fullchanneltv.net. Thank you for watching. Legal Matters continues.